Hey everyone, this is Nico DeGresso from Rambling on the Contrary, and I have quite the interesting topic for today's discussion. So, last week I teased a talk of China and the fact that they are taking steps to control the internet and what we are allowed to see and consume on it, including entertainment and the news. This is an unfortunate reality, and my goal today is to prove to you that the Chinese government should most definitely be seen as a threat to our way of life, and we as a collective need to be aware of the ways in which they have been gaining traction and stay aware of what precedents will be set if they succeed, which would be to suppress all forms of discussion they deem to be non-discussable. Having opinions or thoughts they don't want you to have would be considered an offense, and only the facts and history they want you to know will be available to you. To accomplish this goal, I'm going to talk about what exactly does the Chinese model for digital censorship on social media look like, why it is possible for their views to spread and take a hold of our society, show how there is already subtle influence to view China in a better light in a forceful manner, and finally talk about why they are untrustworthy. But after doing extensive research, I have found so much to talk about that I am going to split this video into two so I can thoroughly cover everything. So today will be part one, where I will discuss what Chinese digital censorship is, their stated intention of spreading it abroad, and how we are beginning to see American social platforms succumb to using similar strategies. Next week, I will expand on the subject by talking about China's prevalence in our entertainment, as well as uncover more examples of how deep they have permeated into our social media and digital platforms, all while showing why they cannot be trusted and why we must resist their spread of censorship. So, to explain how China censors social media, the BBC News has published a video featuring a journalist that lives in Beijing, China, and she talks about her experience in what it's like to live under Chinese rule when it comes to what happens when the government controls what you can see and say.
If you are a company operating in China, you definitely don't want to make the government angry. As a condition to operate in China, you have to obey the Chinese law. If they don't censor certain content, then they might face the punishment by the government, saying you are not obeying the law and the regulation. And as a big company, they certainly don't want to take such risk. So those companies actually do a lot of self-censorship. Some obvious terms like the top Chinese leader's name or some history events like June 4th are obviously banned in China's social media. Maybe those certain words you already know you probably don't want to use on your social media. Even you say something really positive about a government leader, but you kind of, by saying that, by posting that, you kind of got the attention, and people don't want that attention from the authority. Of course, you can choose to, for example, send a so-called sensitive word to your friend, but then you have to face the consequence. A friend of mine just got his WeChat account being blocked for 3 days after he had a conversation with his friend talking about China's legal system and reform on legal system. So because of that, he could not use WeChat for many days. And of course, if you keep posting a lot of topics that the authorities thinks are sensitive, then you might face a consequence. I worked for foreign media for several years.
Just from that small clip, that should be enough to get the idea why it can be dangerous to let the government take away your ability for free speech, as there can be legal consequences, it can hurt your business or brand, and over the course of several decades with this kind of information intervention, literal history can be rewritten. Imagine how big of a revelation it was when you first found out that Christopher Columbus not only wasn't the first person to discover America, but he also was not a highly ethical person. He landed in the Bahamas, and even if you don't count the fact that natives already discovered America by living on the land, there were other Europeans that still stepped foot on the land before Columbus. Now, imagine a reality where no one knows about what happened at Tiananmen Square. Imagine if something as bad as 9/11 or even the Holocaust or some other tragedy could be phased out of the human collective if the government had a reason to not want you to know it. All it would take is a Chinese government-like hold on what we are allowed to see and time. So this article that I have pulled up here is from the US News, and it documents how the Chinese Communist Party has intentions of expanding their sphere of influence abroad. So the president leader of the Chinese Communist Party has stated wherever the readers are, wherever the viewers are, that is where propaganda reports must extend their tentacles. So the country has many practices which include spreading positive reports about the Chinese government and silencing foreign critics, which poses a threat to democracies across the world. So you would think that their vision for the world, utilizing censorship to suppress the people they seek to control, would never go over well in another country, like the US. How can you give a people freedom of speech and then take it away? It doesn't really seem too plausible, too possible. You would think that we would stand up against such a tyrannical move. But what if it turned out that businesses or governments would have a large incentive to make such a change? And what if there was a way for them to be able to successfully pull it off?
There's been a global backlash against Facebook, Google, WhatsApp. This backlash coincides with the rise of the Chinese model. Today you have governments from Russia to Southeast Asia saying, hang on, we get to control content on the internet, and at the same time, that is not an impediment to stunning economic growth.
It's an ideological coup and a rejection of the American internet model, which promised to spur innovation and freedom. Now China is offering a different vision, both internet control and tech innovation, and it has fans.
Today, there would be a growing number of people who would argue that controlling the flow of information across the internet does not actually impede innovation.
The crux of the Chinese internet model is based around the nation state, setting your own rules for your own citizens that can't be circumvented by the internet.
So very simply, they want to control what sort of content is hosted on the internet that's available to Chinese users, and they want absolute control over that content. So if they decide, for instance, that they don't want any references to the Tiananmen massacre of 1989, then they will scrub that out of every website and every app within the country that Chinese consumers can see.
And this controlled, moderated version of the internet is spreading, especially across Southeast Asia. Vietnam's controversial version of the Chinese internet model went into effect in 2019. It demands the data of Vietnamese users is kept in the country. Indonesia, Southeast Asia's largest economy, already requires data to be stored locally. The Philippines has stepped up what critics call a media crackdown, and one of the latest to buy into the rationale is Thailand, which passed a cybersecurity bill modelled on China's. Southeast Asia is the testing ground for Chinese ambitions. The region is home to more than 500 million people whose internet economy is expected to triple to $240 billion by 2025.
I think a lot of Chinese companies and potentially Beijing itself see Southeast Asia as the first step in expanding their influence globally. But that's where the digital Cold War kind of differs from the Cold War we're familiar with. In this case, I think countries are adopting the Chinese-style model without necessarily subscribing to Beijing's style of government and or Beijing's agenda.
China's version of the internet is appealing to other nations who want to control what their populations see and hear, but it doesn't mean China's calling the shots. Instead, it could create an unprecedented bifurcation of the internet, effectively ending our notion of a truly worldwide web, meaning what information you can easily access would depend on where you are and what that government decides you should know.
That video is brought to you by Bloomberg. It's titled China's Vision of a Censored Internet is Spreading. So this suggested model, allowing governments being able to choose what you are allowed to see as well as making all information within the country for local access only, it would be the equivalent of a country living offline and off the grid. We cannot know what they're doing unless we're there, and there are economic incentives for controlling the public. While these countries aren't necessarily subscribed to China's implementation of censorship and method of conducting communism, it doesn't change the fact that these citizens are handing the government the keys to the house and saying, please don't mismanage it. They are giving their power away without even realizing it, or the more likely case is they are unable to stop it from happening to begin with. Now, if you think that something like that couldn't happen to the US or to us, I would like to present you with a parallel to what our social media platforms look like right now. So, as I discussed last week, YouTube was caught censoring the Chinese phrase communist bandits. I entered the video with recorded proof that on Google's YouTube platform, the Chinese phrase communist bandit was censored outright. If this phrase is uttered in the chat, the said chat gets taken down. If you write it as a comment on a video, that comment is immediately scrubbed from existence. Ever since this subject blew up last weekend, Google has since rescinded this feature, saying it was an enforcement error. However, it is worth noting that they chose to not comment on what or why these comments were removed or were designed to be removed in the first place, and it is implied that there are other phrases that are being given the same censored treatment. To document further what YouTube has been censoring on their platform, here's a video with a lawyer talking about the recent developments.
Hey creator, I'm Ian Corzine, your social media lawyer. I'm on a crusade to help creators understand the law of social media, and I also want to protect their artistic freedom. Today we're talking about this systematic takedown by YouTube of videos, podcasts, interviews that at all mention this current economic disaster that we're facing. It seems like every day YouTube is taking down another video and censoring information, preventing users of the platform from accessing information about the current colossal economic disaster that's going on globally. You know, first it was the taking down of the David Icke interview on the London Real podcast. Then YouTube took down the discussion of Dr. Daniel Erickson, who is a hospital doctor who was talking about the fact that in his belief, he alleged that higher ups were encouraging the diagnosis of the disease so that it could spread panic across the globe. And then finally, a couple of days ago, YouTube took down the documentary on the virus called Plandemic by Dr. Judy Miekowitz. All right, before you tune out and say, hey, YouTube was right to pull these videos, these podcasts, these interviews, because these people are crazy. They have outlandish ideas. Before you say that, I want to stop you and I want to pull back the context a little bit. These people are just humans. They're saying what they want to say. They're exercising their right to free speech. And the right to free speech comes at no extra charge in free societies. In America, the right to free speech is guaranteed by the First Amendment. In countries like Japan and Brazil, it's also guaranteed by their constitutions. When societies guarantee, they say you have the right to free speech, it doesn't mean the type of speech that's right, that's necessarily accurate, that's popular, that's mainstream. No, people and societies that have the right to free speech have the right to say what they want to say without fear of censorship or being punished. Now, the right of free speech is not unlimited. Statements made in the public sphere that are designed to encourage crime or fraud or heinous, those can be banned. But in a free society, free discussion of ideas, no matter how crazy, is allowed, must be allowed, and that includes social media. Let me say this again.
So, the subject of the coronavirus is a controversial one, but just because it is a sensitive subject should not mean opposing or differing views should be silenced. The problem here is not misinformation, as there is none in the video presented. It's the removal of discussion. It is an attempt to control the narrative of what is okay to say and what isn't. You could call it a stretch, since there are human lives at risk in this instance due to the danger of COVID. Sure, but the CDC just came out with their estimated fatality rate, their updated one, and it has dropped from over 3% to 0.4%. This is a significant drop, and it comes from the Center for Disease Control, so it is most definitely credible. Should we censor the CDC because that new estimate does not fit the current narrative of staying indoors at all cost? Not to mention the implications this has on the political narrative that I am sure you have all have seen and have had conversations on. Well, I think this is a good stopping point for now. I have so much more to say, but I want the next video to be focused on to what lengths the Chinese government goes to make sure anyone that discusses them or their country do so in a positive manner. From their diplomatic conversations with foreign countries, to the entertainment industry, all the way to the platforms we use to access information on the internet, being social media platforms. They are policing what you are allowed to say. On top of this, we have a good reason to not trust them with handling how we communicate with each other. Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope some of this information resonated with you, and you'll be hearing from me next week to finish this topic. Thanks again.